Welcome. On behalf of authors at Google, it is my privilege to introduce philosopher and author Rebecca Newberger Goldstein today. Among her many honors, Ms. Goldstein became a MacArthur Foundation Fellow in 1996. In awarding her the prize, the MacArthur Foundation described her work in the following words. Rebecca Goldstein is a writer whose novels and short stories dramatize the concerns of philosophy without sacrificing the demands of imaginative storytelling. Her books tell a compelling story as they describe with wit, compassion, and originality the interaction of mind and heart. In her fiction, her characters confront problems of faith, religious faith, and faith in an ability to comprehend the mysteries of the physical world as complementary to moral and emotional states of being. Goldstein's writings emerge as brilliant arguments for the belief that fiction in our time may be the best vehicle for involving readers in questions of morality and existence. Currently, she is a research associate in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. Ms. Goldstein is here today to talk about her latest book, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. Following the talk, we will have a Q&A session, and if you can remember our remote audience and speak up, that'll help. And now, please join me in welcoming Rebecca Newberger Goldstein.
Thank you, Pat, for the introduction, and thank you who've come to hear a novelist. That means a lot to me, actually. I take novel writing very seriously, and as I think that is, in fact, a way of exploring deep philosophical questions. This particular novel is one that's devoted to the long-standing, the latest installment in the long-standing debate between religion and science, faith and reason. It's about those who call themselves the new atheists and a lot of others. And it takes place over the course of 1 week with many incursions from the past. Just like the debates themselves, the voice of this novel is often very noisy and raucous, and there are many large and assertive personalities. There is, for example, an extreme distinguished professor of faith, literature, and values. That's his actual title, extreme distinguished. That was the only way that the university could lure him there. And he actually constitutes a department of one. He's very, very happy about this. He doesn't have to deal with any colleagues, and if he calls a faculty meeting, he can boycott it. And there's a woman who is a anthropologist, and her Amazonian hunter-gatherers have dubbed her with a word that means a whole lot of woman. And there's a very small mathematical genius. Mathematical geniuses tend to populate my fiction. This one is the son of a Hasidic Rebbe, that is a kind of very insular sect of extremely Orthodox Jews, and the title of Rebbe, head honcho, is hereditary, so he's destined to be the Rebbe himself someday, and he is 6 years old. He sees the numbers, and he thinks that they're angels. Lots and lots of characters in this book. Though it's actually a very boisterous book, it starts very quietly, and I'm going to read to you from the quiet beginning, from a sort of condensed version of the first chapter, which is called The Argument from the Improbable Self. All of the chapters, and there are 36 of them, have names like The Argument from Something Weird, The Argument from the New York Times, or The Argument from Dappled Things. There's actually also an appendix, which is nonfiction and sets forth, or I think of it as nonfiction, it sets forth 36 arguments for the existence of God, some which are quite common, some which my character makes up, and all of the arguments have rebuttals. They all are laid out in an analytic way and with flaws exposed. Anyway, I'm going to read to you from the argument from the improbable self. Something shifted, something so immense you could call it the world. Call it the world. The world shifted, catching lots of smart people off guard, churning up issues you had thought had settled forever beneath the Earth's crust. The more sophisticated you are, the more annotated your mental life, the more taken aback you're likely to feel, seeing what the world's lurch has brought to light, thrusting up beliefs and desires you had assumed belonged to an earlier stage of human development. What is this stuff, you ask one another, and how can it still be kicking around, given how much we already know? It looks like the kind of relics that archaeologists dig up and dust off, speculating about the beliefs that once had animated them to the best that they can be reconstructed. Gone as they are now, those thrashings of proto-rationality and mythico-magical hypothesizing, and nearly forgotten. Now it's all gone unforgotten, and minds that have better things to think about have to divert precious neuronal resources to figuring out how to knock some sense back into the species. It's a tiresome proposition having to take up the work of the Enlightenment all over again, but it's happened on your watch. You ought to have sent up a balloon now and then to get a read on the prevailing cognitive conditions, the thinks watching out for the think-nots. Now you've gone and let the stockpiling of fallacies reach dangerous levels, and the masked weapons of illogic are threatening the survivability of the globe. None of this is particularly good for the world, but it has been good for Cass Seltzer. That's what he's thinking at this moment, gazing down at the frozen river and regarding the improbable swerve his life has lately taken. He's thinking his life has gotten better because the world has gone bonkers. He's thinking zealots proliferate and Seltzer prospers. It's 4 a.m. and Cass Seltzer is standing on Weeks Bridge, the graceful arc that spans the Charles River near Harvard University, staring down at the river below, which is in the rigor mortis of late February in New England. The whole vista is deserted beyond vacancy, deserted in the way of being inhospitable to human life. There's not a car passing on Memorial Drive, and the elegant river dorms are darkened to silent hulks, the most hyperkinetic of undergraduates sedated to purring girls and boys. It's not like Cass Seltzer to be out in the middle of an icy night, lost in thought while losing sensation in his extremities. Excitement had gotten the better of him. He had lain in his bed for hours, mind racing, until he gave up and crawled out from under the Lux comforter that his girlfriend, Lucinda Mandelbaum, had brought with her when she moved in with him recently. This comforter has pockets for the hands and feet and a softness that's the result of impregnation with aloe vera. As a man, Cass had been skeptical, but he's become a begrudging believer in Lucinda's comforter and in her Tempur-Pedic pillow, too, suffused with the fragrance of her coconut shampoo, making it all the more remarkable that he'd forsake his bed for this no-man's stretch of frigid night. Rummaging in the front closet for some extra protection, he had pulled out a long-forgotten item, the tricolor scarf that his ex-wife, Pascal, had learned to knit for him during the 4 months when she was recovering from aphasia. 4 months that had produced, along with other shockers, an excessively long French flag of a wool scarf, which he wound 7.5 times round his neck before heading out into the dark to deal with the rush in his head. Lucinda's away tonight, away for the entire bleak week to come. Cass is missing Lucinda in his bones, missing her in the marrow that's presently crystallizing into ice. She's in warmer climes at a conference in Santa Barbara on non-Nash equilibria in zero-sum games. Among these equilibria is one that's called the Mandelbaum equilibrium, and it's Cass's ambition to have the Mandelbaum equilibrium mastered by the time he picks her up from the airport Friday night. Technically, Lucinda's a psychologist, like Cass, only not like Cass at all. Her work is so mathematical that almost no one would suspect it has anything to do with mental life. Cass, on the other hand, is about as far away on the continuum as you can get and still be in the same field. He's so far away that he's knee-deep in the swampy humanities. For close to 2 decades, Cass Seltzer has all but owned the psychology of religion, but only because nobody else wanted it. But now things had happened, fundamental and fundamentalist things, and religion as a phenomenon is on everybody's mind. And among all the changes that religion's new towering profile has wrought in the world, which are mostly alarming, if not downright terrifying, is the transformation in the life of one Cass Seltzer. First had come the book, which he had entitled The Varieties of Religious Illusion. The book had brought Cass an indecent amount of attention. Time magazine, in a cover story on the so-called new atheists, had singled him out as the only one among them who seems to have any idea of what it feels like to be a believer, and had ended by dubbing him the atheist with a soul. Next had come the girl, although that designation hardly does justice to the situation, not when the situation stands for the likes of Lucinda Mandelbaum, known in her world as the goddess of game theory. And now, only today, as if his cup weren't already gushing over, had come a letter from Harvard, laying out its intention of luring him away from Frankfurter University, located in nearby Wheaton, Massachusetts. Cass has the letter on him right now, bearing the insignia of Veritas, zippered into an inside pocket of his parka, insulating him against the cold. The night is so frigid that everything seems to have been stripped bare of superfluous existence, reduced to the purity of abstraction. Cass has the distinct impression that he can see better in the sharpened air and takes off his glasses and of course can hardly see a thing past the nimbus phantom of his own breath, but then he stares harder and it seems that he can see better, that the world has slipped into sharper focus. It's only now that he catches sight of the spectacle that the extreme cold has created in the river below, frozen solid except where it's forced through the 3 arches of the bridge's substructure, creating an effect that could reasonably be called sublime, and in the Kantian sense, not cozily beautiful, but touched by a metaphysical chill. The quickened water has sculpted 3 immense and perfect arches into the solid ice, soaring 50 or 60 feet to their apices, sublime, almost as if by design. Standing dead center on Weeks Bridge, in the dead of winter, in the dead of night, staring down at the sublime formation, Cass is contemplating the strange thing that his life has become. To him, his life has become strange to him. He feels as if he's wearing somebody else's coat, grabbed in a hurry after a boozy party. He's walking around in someone else's bespoke cashmere, while that guy's got Cass's hooded parka, and only Cass seems to have noticed the switch. Excuse me. What has happened is that Cass Seltzer has become an intellectual celebrity. He's become famous for his abstract ideas. And not just any old abstract ideas, but atheist abstract ideas, which makes him, according to some of the latest polls, a spokesperson for the most distrusted minority in America, the one that most Americans are least willing to allow their children to marry. This is a fact. Studies have found that a large proportion of Americans rate atheists below Muslims, recent immigrants, gays, Jews, and communists in, quote, sharing their vision of America, unquote. Cass Seltzer has become the unlikely poster boy for this mistrusted group. His is a good face for counteracting the fallacy of equating godlessness with vice. Cass's fundamental niceness is written all over him. He's got a strong jaw, a high ovoid forehead from which his floppy auburn hair is only just slightly receding, and the sweetest, most earnest smile this side of Oral Roberts University. The atheist with a soul. Cass always smiles at the absurdity of the phrase. But which is the more absurd element? The truth is, and what's the good of a man contemplating an inhumanly frozen world at 4 a.m. if no truth-telling ensues, that Cass is somewhat at a loss to account for what he's done. How to explain those 36 arguments for the existence of God? See appendix. All of them formally constructed in the preferred analytic mode, premises parading with military precision, and every shirking presupposition and sketchy implication forced out into the open and subjected to rigorous inspection. Cass had started out with all the standard arguments for God's existence, the ones discussed in philosophy classes and textbooks. The cosmological argument number 1, the ontological argument number 2, the classical teleological argument number 3a, the arguments from miracles, moral truths, and mysticism, numbers 11, 16, and 22, respectively, Pascal's wager, number 31, and William James's argument from pragmatism, number 32. He had analyzed the new batch of arguments recently whipped up by the intelligent design crowd, to wit, the argument from irreducible complexity, number 3b, the argument from the paucity of benign mutations, excuse me, number 3c, the argument from the original replicator, number 3d, the argument from the Big Bang, number 4, the argument from the fine-tuning of the physical constants, number 5, and the argument from the hard problem of consciousness, number 12. But he had gone beyond these two, attempting to polish up into genuine arguments those religious intuitions and emotions that are often powerfully evocative, but too sub-syllogistic to be regarded as actual arguments. He had tried to capture under the net of analytic reason those fleeting shadows cast by unseen winged things darting through the thick foliage of the religious sensibility. So, for example, he had formulated the argument from the improbable self, number 13, struggling to squeeze into precision the sense of paradox that he knows too well, the flailing attempt to calm the inside-outside vertigo to which he's given at odd moments in his life, but which he can always reliably bring upon himself by staring too long at the improbable fact of his being identical with himself. If somebody hasn't personally experienced this particular kind of metaphysical seizure, then it's hard to find the words to give a sense of what it's like. Cass had experienced it even as a boy, lying in bed and thinking his way into the sense of the strangeness of being just this. Cass had the lower bunk bed. Both he and Jesse, his younger brother, had wanted the higher bunk. But as usual, Jesse had wanted what he wanted so much more than Cass had wanted it, with a fury of need that was exhausting just to watch, that Cass had let it go. Lying there, awake on his lower bunk, Cass would think about being himself and not being Jesse. There was Jesse, and here was Cass. But if someone else were looking at the two of them, Jesse there, Cass here, how could that person tell that he, Cass, was Cass here and not Jesse there? If it got switched on them, everything the same about them, the body and memories and sense of self and everything else, only now he was Jesse here and there was Cass there, how would anybody know? How would he know? How would Jesse? Maybe a switch had already happened. Maybe it happened again and again. And how could anybody tell? The longer he tried to get a fix on the fact of being Cass here, the more the whole idea of it just got away from him. If he tried long enough to grasp it, then he could get the fact of being Cass here to just blank out of existence and then come dribbling weakly back in like a fluorescent fixture flickering on and off toward death. He would get the sense of having been shut out of himself and now was someone who was regarding his being Cass Seltzer as something like his being in the 6th grade, just something about him that happened to be true. Who was that other that he was who was regarding his being Cass Seltzer as if he didn't have to be Cass Seltzer? Excuse me. The sense of giddiness induced by these exercises could be a bit too overwhelming for a kid in a lower bunk bed. It could be a bit overwhelming still. Here I am, Cass is saying, standing on Weeks Bridge and talking aloud into the sublimely indifferent night. Cass knows he needs to tamp down his tendencies toward the transcendent. It isn't becoming in America's favorite atheist, who is at this moment Cass Seltzer, who is somehow or other just this here. Here I am. How can it be that of all things one is this thing, so that one can say astonishingly, in the right frame of mind it is astonishing, with the metaphysical chill blowing in from afar, here I am. When you didn't force yourself to think in formal reconstructions, when you didn't catch these moments of ravishments under the lens of premises and conclusions, when you didn't impale them and label them like so many splayed butterflies bleeding the transcendental glow right out of them, then what? It's even hard at a time like this to resist the shameful narcissistic appeal of reasonings like the argument from personal coincidences, number 8, and the argument from answered prayers, number 9, and the argument from a wonderful life, number 10. William James had rebuked the, quote, scoundrel logic, unquote, that calculates divine providence from one's own little goodie bag of gains. And Cass couldn't agree more with the spirit of James. But here it is, his bulging goodie bag, and call him a scoundrel for being personally grateful to the universe, when at this same moment that he's standing on Weeks Bridge and tossing hosannas out into the infinite universe, there are at this same time multitudes of others whose lives are painfully constricting with misfortunes that are just as arbitrary and undeserved as his own expansive good luck. But Cass Seltzer does feel grateful. At moments like this, could Cass altogether withstand the sense that, hard to put it into words, the sense that the universe is personal? That there is something personal that grounds existence in order and value and purpose and meaning? And that the grandeur of the personal universe has somehow infiltrated and is expanding his own small person, bringing his littleness more into line with its grandeur? That the personal universe has been personally kind to him, gracious and forgiving to Cass Seltzer, gratuitously, exorbitantly, divinely kind, and this despite Cass's having, with callowness and shallowness of forethought, thrown spitballs at the whole idea of cosmic intentionality? No, that doesn't capture it either. Those words are far too narrowed by Cass's own particular life, when what it is he could feel, has felt, might even be feeling now, has nothing to do with the contents of Cass's existence, but rather with existence itself. This what? This expansion out into the world, which is a kind of love, he supposes, a love for the whole of existence, that could so easily well up in Cass Seltzer at this moment, standing here in the pure abstractions of this night and contemplating the strange thisness of his life when viewed sub specie eternitatis, that is to say, from the vantage point of eternity, which comes so highly recommended to us by Spinoza. Here it is then, the sense that existence is just such a tremendous thing. One comes into it astonishingly. Here one is, formed by biology and history, genes and culture, in the midst of the contingency of the world. here one is. One doesn't know how, one doesn't know why, and suddenly one doesn't know where one is either, or who, or what one is either. And all that one knows is that one is a part of it, a considered and conscious part of it, generated and sustained in existence in ways one can hardly comprehend, all the time conscious of it, though, of existence, the fullness of it, the reaching expanse and pulsing intricacy of it. And one wants to live in a way that at least begins to do justice to it. One wants to expand one's reach of it as far as expansion is possible, and even beyond that, to live one's life in a way commensurate with the privilege of being a part of and conscious of the whole reeling, glorious, infinite sweep. A sweep that includes so improbably a psychologist of religion named Cass Seltzer, who, moved by powers beyond himself, did something more improbable than all the improbabilities constituting his improbable existence could have entailed, did something that won him someone else's life, a better life, a more brilliant life, a life beyond all the ones he had wished for in the pounding obscurity of all his yearnings, because all of this couldn't belong to him, to the man who stands on Week's bridge, wrapped round in a scarf his once beloved ex-wife Pascal had knit for him for some necessary reason that he would never know, perhaps to offer him some protection against the desolation she knew would soon be his, and was, but is no longer. Suspended here above sublimity, his cheeks aflame with either euphoria or frostbite, a letter in his zippered pocket with the imprimatur of Veritas, and a Lucinda Mandelbaum with whom to share it all. Thank you. So that's what an atheist with a soul looks like. Are there any questions?
I'll ask a question.
Thank you.
Can I go to the mumble mumble?
This mic is on.
Oh, where's the mic? Okay. Hello.
Hi.
This existence of God thing seems more semantic than substantive, in that the definition of God or cosmic intentionality can be watered down continually to the point where, well, that must exist. And the real question is, what is God? How does God exist? Does that make any sense?
That makes total sense. So,
In this very active contemporary debate between so-called new atheists or just atheists and believers, what's the substance here? When people declare themselves as atheists, what are they denying the existence of? If just about anything can be defined as God, including, as my hero Spinoza defined it, the final theory of everything, the theory that's going to, explain why the laws of nature are the laws of nature and why they had to be realized in this world. So what's the substance of calling yourself an atheist? And I think here's what they have in mind, or what we have in mind when we deny. It's the notion of a transcendent being, something that exists outside of the laws of nature, outside of space and time, matter and energy, and that willed the world into existence, willed the laws of nature to be the ones that they are, and moreover, lay down the laws of morality, grounded the difference between right and wrong, and moreover, whose purpose is meant to be our purpose, that we're meant to understand our own lives in terms of the purpose of this transcendent moral creator. So that's the idea, when people, I think, are denying the existence of God, they're denying the existence of that ontology.
It sounds like when you talk about God, or you say how people who God, that the word God, it's definitely a subset of what are called personal gods, that gods that have share the characteristics of a person, having will or intention, thought, and excluding other forms of God that more exotic. And I think that there are a handful of religions where their concept of God is actually maybe among the exotic. So it sounds like this is more or less a debate about Western religion and its value as opposed to worldwide.
Yeah, so it really is about
This contemporary debate that's going on, you know, that it's suddenly, and it's quite interesting to a philosopher to have this sort of philosophical discussion that you talk about in your philosophy classes, suddenly taking over the public square, to be so much involved in public discussion. And it's really about that debate and the denial of that particular very Western conception of God. And all of the 36 arguments that are in the appendix worked out, and I tried to give them the best form possible, because it's no good to rebut arguments unless you make them the very best possible. So I really try to work them up as well as I can. They are all, except for one, number 35, but all the other ones are for the notion of a transcendent God, a very Western notion of God, the kind of God that the popular monotheistic religions recognized, right? Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So it's really that conception. And these are arguments for the existence of that God. The one exception is number 35, which is the argument for Spinoza's God. And that's basically an argument for, it's a non-transcendent God. It's a God who is immanent in the world, who is basically identical to the final theory of everything. So that's the one exception. That's the more exotic God and that one has also played a role in Western culture, Western history of ideas, so I include it. But yeah, it's about this debate going on now, and therefore it's about the Western conception of God. Thank you. Well,
so it makes a lot of sense that your protagonist is a psychologist, because it seems that the key question is, why do people buy into this mythology kind of thinking, right? And the rationale doesn't sway them or whatever, and they keep going that way.
I think that's usually
Do you think of indoctrination?
no.
well, I would actually love to hear yours and see how close it is to Cass's explanation of why.
Well,
Do you use the microphone?
the set of genes, the code for curiosity, is obviously selected for once a species gets past a certain point where know-how becomes a survival advantage. So the set of genes that cause one to instinctually, and I'm using the word instinct highly, they manifest themselves as a feeling of discomfort when confronted with answers, when confronted with questions which you don't have answers. It's the other side, the exploratory instinct, curiosity. So something as important as what happens after death, the absence of an answer to that question produces such an uncomfortable feeling because of your inherited, call it species memory. It causes such an uncomfortable feeling that it cannot be tolerated, and so answers must be invented rather than saying, gee, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a large part of it, and so many of the arguments in the appendix are, this is an irresolvable dilemma. So there's the argument from free will, the argument of survival of death. There are just a bunch of arguments, the arguments for moral truths, things that we don't quite have a clear-cut, not quite have, we don't have a clear-cut answer to, and it's a kind of substitution of one mystery for another. So we'll bury this mystery in the mystery of God, and then this will provide an answer. But I think it's more, I think that's part of it, and actually either Cass or I call it the ontological urge. I don't remember if it was his term or mine, or if I actually even end up using it in the book. But in any case, one of us calls it this ontological urge. Here we are, and we are capable of self-consciousness, of forming an idea of ourselves and of the universe, and of trying to, and of asking these questions about the universe and our relationship to it. And wanting answers, and the intolerability of the lack of answers that are forthcoming really does sit very, very uncomfortably. I think that's also part of it. That's part of it. I think there's more. And one of the things that Cass thinks as a psychologist of religion is that the religious impulse, the religious reaction is complicated. So that, for example, some of our inherited feelings of disgust also finds an outlet in the religious emotions. The notion of spiritual purity
is a way of also doing justice to this notion of disgust, which has great survival value. We feel disgust at things that carry germs, whatever, and it becomes, given the kinds of abstract makers that we are, it becomes more abstract, and so there is a notion of the body itself being impure, of other people being carriers of impurity. This too finds an outlet in certain religious emotions. Tribalism finds who we can trust, who are those that share our values, finds an outlet in religious emotions. It's complicated. So there's certainly the ontological urge, and so many of the actual arguments for the existence of God that Cass explores in his appendix, it's actually the appendix of his book, deal with this discomfort that you have located in when answers are not forthcoming. But to get back to the question of that he's a psychologist of religion, and I've been asked quite a few times, why has new atheism emerged recently in basically the last 10 years? There have been these big books, Dennett and Dawkins and Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and many others. Excuse me. Why now? And I think part of it is it's the obvious answer. What the violence that has occurred in more extreme and zealot forms of religion. So it's not just this cozy, sweet little thing, but it's the more violent and virulent forms that have emerged. But also, I do think the progress that's been made in psychology, in particular in evolutionary psychology. We've already been sort of throwing off some sort of evolutionary psychological explanations for religion. So, you know, when you want to argue against something, it's never enough to just show that the arguments don't work, that they fail. But the next part of it is to show why people would nevertheless continue to believe. And evolutionary psychology has now been able to tackle that and give us answers to that. That's a very, for those of you who read David Hume, who's a great hero to free thinkers everywhere, his way of arguing against a position is always, first you show there's no argument for it. The arguments fail. So the idea of necessary connection, for example, that he went after in a big way. And then the second half is to turn to psychology. You find this move all the time in David Hume, and to say, look, here is why nevertheless we have an almost irresistible impulse to believe in this thing. He didn't have, of course, evolutionary psychology at his disposal in the 18th century, but that's that kind of mood. So yeah, I made my guy a psychologist of religion because that's where the second half of this kind of argument is coming from. And if you actually look at those who have been in the forefront of arguing atheism, this pushback, it's coming from people in evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology. And I think that, you know, it's a measure of the strength of the behavioral sciences that they now have something to say about the psychology of religion. It's the second half of that argument. So that's why he's a psychologist of religion.
When Voltaire had said, if God did not exist, that man would have to have been in a less sexist form, I think he was trying to say that we're constantly seeking a way to explain the unexplainable.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you are familiar with, there's a book called Why God Won't Go Away, and talking about the biological basis of belief, some of the experiments you just referring to evolutionary biology and psychology, some of the experiments that were done with near-death experiences where people had a religious experience, also on psychedelics and various other things, and they were opining that there is a biological basis for why people believe these things, but that there was another explanation other than the existence of God. And I wondered if you are familiar with this work and if it had influenced your work.
I don't know that particular work. I did read a lot about experiments, you know, of this sort and explanations of this sort. I will read this work now, but it is too late, you might say. But I think we have it. I think we have it covered. Yeah, that, I mean, clearly, now here's one of the things. I mean, in that first chapter, I sort of show you going through a kind of spiritual experience. And this sort of, and it is the kind of experience that Spinoza talks about, this intellectual love of God, but you nevertheless resist trying to explain this experience in religious terms, in terms of that transcendent other thing that you're confronting in this experience. You stop with existence itself. What a tremendous thing existence itself is, and even sometimes a kind of gratitude, you know, that I think we've all felt. I know in studying physics, I'm always overwhelmed, you know, that the laws of physics, I mean, they're just so beautiful, and you feel this sort of something, you know, or a mathematical proof, or music, or art, you know, this something that takes you out of yourself, and you feel your own smallness in relation to the grandeur, and you almost can get swallowed up in it, and it's grand, it's marvelous. It's a kind of feeling of transcendence. I think for some reason that evolutionary psychologists have not yet been able to explain, we have this capacity, and in fact creativity gives us this capacity. It's an intensifying of this feeling. I think good things come from this. Romantic love can give it to one too, and good things can sometimes even come from romantic love. I hear tell, no, but it is very natural to put that into religious terms, as I think as a kind of metaphor. And even, excuse me, Cass says, that this universe has been, exorbitantly, gratuitously, divinely kind. It's very, very easy to that's the vocabulary that we have available to us. I mean, that we've sort of inherited. And so it's very, very easy to slip into that metaphor and then to be misled by, I think, one's metaphor. And that's a kind of Wittgensteinian notion that, you can be misled by your metaphors. It fits in certain ways. It doesn't fit in other ways. That's why it's a metaphor. But you get misled and you go off in these other directions. And I tend to think of a lot of religiosity as that, being misled by one's metaphors. However, I shouldn't be saying what I think. Cass thinks. The wonderful thing about writing novels rather than philosophy is, I don't have to defend the views. It's my character. But yes, he does feel that. And so he when he gets carried off by these experiences, he nevertheless will resist the urge to go one step beyond and see this as an experience and evidence for God.
So this is a little bit related to what you were just saying. So most of the conversation we've been having here is about the arguments for and against God and why they have them and all that kind of stuff. Why is it that you decided to write this novel instead of writing varieties of religious illusion?
Yes.
I assume it's not just so that you can have it back away from the arguments.
Well, I am a coward,
but I do sometimes go on, stand by my beliefs. My last book in fact, my last two books had been nonfiction. One was on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, incompleteness, the proof and paradox of Gödel. And then the next one was on Spinoza, betraying Spinoza, the renegade Jew who gave us modernity. And both of those books, in fact, they're parts of series, and I had been asked to write about them, so I wrote about them. Partly as a result of publishing the Spinoza book, I got very drawn into this new debate between atheists and believers, and drawn into the movement of the new atheists. Spinoza is he's a hero to free thinkers, and so I got invited to give talks to organizations, associations of pro-science, pro-reason, sometimes more or less anti-religious groups. And I'm on Sam Harris's, on his board for the Reason Foundation. I just, as a result, got drawn into this, and it interested me very much. But I felt that something was being left out of the discussion, that there is something about, that part of this, these differences of opinion have to do with very different experiences of the world, or sometimes very much the same sort of experiences, but different language that you're putting to this experience. And so for religious people, sometimes it seemed that those who were denying God were denying any kind of spiritual expansion, any kind of transcendence. So it seemed to me important to present an atheist who is very capable of this sort of experience. And on the other side, among those whom I very much agree with, in fact, the new atheists, sometimes a tendency to not do justice to the complexity of the religious emotion, and that it has a lot to do, it has to do with other things. Why is this sentence not coming out? It has to do with things other than the belief in God, and demonstrating the fallacies in these arguments often don't do anything at all. It has to do sometimes with these existential dilemmas that one simply cannot tolerate. It has to do with often feelings of affinity with certain groups of, with certain people, with family loyalties, a certain narrative. It's a complicated business, and whenever I feel like some philosophical issue is very tied in with different ways of experiencing the world, I always get driven to write a novel. I mean, almost against my will, because it seems to me that that's what the novel is made for. It's made for exploring how the world feels to different characters. That's how you create a character in a novel. It's really a worldview and what the world feels like to each of these characters. And so since this debate seemed to me, the more I got into it, the more it seemed to me to have it had a lot to do with just worlds colliding. The world is simply very, very different for these different people, and they're talking past each other, and sometimes agreeing more than they realize. I'd have to write a novel about it. And also another thing that I'm committed to, again, it's a very Spinozist idea, is that cognition and emotion are not as separated from each other as we in Western philosophy have assumed. That there is a way of experiencing emotionally certain truths that gives it a kind of substance and makes it one's own in a way that pure cognition doesn't. And you know, and this kind of Tony Damasio's view, what was the book? Searching for Spinoza, Looking for Spinoza. Tony Damasio, and a neuroscientist who says, it's coming out of his lab's verification of this Spinozistic view that the emotions and the intellect are not as separated as we've assumed. And what you can do in a novel that you are simply not allowed to do in analytic philosophy is infuse emotions into, show how these intellectual views are also connected with the emotional life. And you simply can't do that in the kind of philosophy in which I'm trained. So I do it in novels. And it actually can bring the reader, give the reader a participation in a emotion that they would normally not have. So I've actually had some of my friends from the atheist movement say, look, they just really never even knew what it felt like, what people are talking about when they're talking about spiritual experiences, and now they know. Somehow going through it with Cass in his very secular way gave them some sort of understanding of what it would be like to be drawn out of yourself in this kind of transcendent way. So that, for me, is great validation of the power of fiction.
Okay.
We're done, right?